So, as I say, we're responsible for enforcement of the laws on food contact materials, but also all the food legislation, and there are equivalents of our organisation in the other member states in Europe and in the other countries as well. So I'll talk about the regulatory view. In terms of the overview, I'll speak about the controls, mainly inspection and sampling activities, the challenges that arise on that, certain assumptions that are perhaps implicit and should be discussed, and some supports we've developed for inspectors and industry in the area. So this slide, I won't talk you through the detail of it. I think most of you will know this, but this is the legislation on food contact materials, the harmonised EU legislation, a general framework regulation that sets requirements for all food contact materials for safety, labelling and traceability, and gives the mandate for the specific measures, a GMP regulation for good manufacturing practice, and specific measures on certain materials and substances. But there are plenty of materials that aren't listed there. I've put some of them down here. So they don't have specific harmonised EU legislation. So what do we do? Well, we have to enforce the framework regulation and the GMP regulation. Some countries will have national legislation or recommendations, and industry guidelines can be not enforced, but can be complied with, perhaps as well. But that's a challenge in itself, the absence of harmonised legislation for all the materials. So, as well as that legislation that you'd be familiar with, we of course also have to comply with other legislation. There's the Regulation 178/2002, the General Food Law, which obliges us to do official controls. The Official Controls Regulation 882/2004 details very prescriptively how those controls are to be done, and those requirements are increasing in a revision of that legislation, which will have implications for the official laboratories doing the testing in a few years' time. And of course, the framework regulation itself specifies how the controls are to be done. Additionally, most member states will have their own national legislation governing the enforcement bodies' activities, giving them enforcement powers and so on. Just to point out, the responsibility to comply will always be with the industry. I'll be talking about the enforcement of the regulations without going into that bigger question of whether those regulations and the requirements and the limits set in them are in fact enough and conservative enough to protect consumers' health, which is the ultimate aim. So I'll just talk about the enforcement. So in a sense then, in Europe, we've got a series of controls on controls, or checks on checks. Own checks by the food contact materials industry, checks hopefully by the food industry, checks by the member states' official controls, and we've got the European Commission coming in with its Food and Veterinary Office that carries out checks on how food legislation is enforced. And they've done missions to look at how we enforce the food contact materials legislation. And they publish those reports. So there's another challenge for us. So we move on to the controls in Ireland, and this is a very simplified scheme of the supply chain for food contact materials, starting with some kind of raw material of some kind, might be natural gas or ethylene or something. Then we've got somebody who manufactures that, maybe converts ethylene to polyethylene, somebody else who changes that polyethylene into useful things like bags or articles of some kind. And then it goes to a food industry or directly for direct sale to final consumers, with importers and distributors involved at all the stages. Again, a very simple schematic, the food industry reduced down to just one box, and I think most of you will be aware of the complexity that really lies behind that food supply chain. So, as with most member states, I think you'll find that for many years, well-developed systems for checks by food inspectors at this level in the food industry. But there's a challenge when you attempt to go in enforcing legislation further up, because the technologies and the jargon of those industries and the basic technologies are very different from what's in a food company. And there's a big kind of a knowledge gulf there, which is a challenge. You know, you've got to have people going in there who aren't phased by the terminology, who can deal with concepts like functional barriers, non-intentionally added substances, who can tell their aids to polymerization from their polymer production aids, because they're both defined separately and regulated differently in the plastics regulation. And that's a challenge. In Ireland, we have a separate inspectorate, the National Standards Authority of Ireland, which carries out these checks because they have a background of being more involved in these kind of process-controlled type manufacturing industries. Some kind of generalities about their findings in the suppliers, which we've been implementing for the last few years, are that there are indeed quality systems being applied, that they're having products and raw materials tested, whether by themselves or their suppliers. But there are some negatives. They're reliant often on their suppliers for expertise, we find. And the declarations of compliance tend to be of relatively poor quality. I'll come back to that later on. So the checks by the food industry, let's return to those, or the checks by the food inspectors in the food industry. That's an area where inspectors are often questioning quite what checks they have to do because they see packaging, typically, and they see documentation that comes in with that packaging. But a lot of that, maybe they don't have the ability to check and verify those directly. And a lot of the attention focuses and should focus on the way that the food industry is using the documentation it receives as part of its HACCP system, its hazard analysis and critical control point system. So in terms of sampling and testing, which will always be part of the official controls, here are some of the kind of foods and food contact materials that get sampled in Ireland, and some of the contaminants. And if you look in other member states, they'll be more or less the same. These would be relatively standard contaminants associated with food contact materials. And one point you can see is that it's a relatively short list that gets tested, particularly if you compare it with the many thousands of chemicals that were mentioned earlier today. So that's the laboratory is always going to be constrained with regard to the volume and the nature of the testing. And it's something that needs to be done on a European-wide basis in a coordinated approach. Here's some picture of some kitchen utensils awaiting testing from our laboratory. And here's another challenge. When you test some of these things, like the nylon kitchen utensils, which have been a problem for some time, then you've got to do something when you get a non-compliant result. Now, some part of that is relatively straightforward. You can declare, well, that exceeds the migration limits set in the regulation, so we'll have the batch withdrawn from sale. But you do have a question mark, for example, over what about a product that's already reached consumers, and you know it's reached consumers. Do you try to do a consumer recall of such articles? That would be quite difficult, because I'd suggest to you that most of you in your kitchen might have articles like this, but you don't have the plastic tag that tells you when and where you got it or what the batch number was, and they all look the same. So there are practical issues there, and that's a challenge for us. Another challenge is to work out what the actual exposure is. The tests are done under quite severe conditions to deliberately to kind of exaggerate the exposure and set severe tests. But that doesn't mean that you've got an automatic conversion from the laboratory test result to actual consumer exposure. Another challenge for us. Okay. So a few years ago now, we organised a survey through our agencies who are carrying out the inspections in the food industry, and we looked at the documentation and the labelling and traceability associated with plastic food packaging as it reached into the food industry. So the results are slightly dated, but I think they're still of interest. With regard to labelling, we got very high compliance levels, just 5% not compliant. With regard to traceability, just 3% not compliant. These are good high compliance rates in these areas. When it comes, however, to the actual quality of the declarations of compliance, at that time we had very high rates of non-compliance with regard to, this was by assessing the declarations against the 9 points that are specified in the plastics regulation. And you can see very substantial rates of non-compliance. The good part of it was that often the companies, the food companies, were able to say that their plastics suppliers had given them test results or certificates of some kind, but they were in various formats, or sometimes they might be what we'd regard as the supporting documents for the declarations. So there's a kind of an education exercise there. So there's the challenge for us. That experience, we've seen other reports of people from other agencies, from the Dutch authorities, looking to saying that the documentation of food contact materials needed to be improved. And indeed, since we're in the canton of Zurich, I should point out a study that they did about a year ago, where they published that the insufficient paperwork was being delivered with the packaging. So some general challenges then. We've got complex legislation. It changes. The packaging technology changes. The toxicological concerns change, as we've heard in previous presentations. The laboratory facilities are limited. The inspectors rely on the documentation, and inspectors in food companies have many competing priorities. They have a lot of food legislation to enforce across a breadth of things, and can find it difficult to devote sufficient time or to identify the correct balance of time between food contact materials and other equally valid concerns. So I've written assume like this, because I want to talk about some assumptions. And the word assume, you always have to be careful of a word that manages to combine you and me and an ass, okay? Assumptions are widely used when we're doing things like exposure considerations, the standard test regime, and so on. And over the years, those kind of exposure models have gotten more sophisticated, and we've moved on from the idea of the kind of standard cube of food, 6 decimeters squared per kilogram, and so on. But even with the more sophisticated exposure models, there's always assumptions. I want to talk about a couple more assumptions that are maybe ones we need to talk a bit more on. Assumption 1 is honesty. Now, this is a little embarrassing because I'm here present in the middle, and there's lots of industry people from the food side and the packaging side. And, am I questioning their honesty and integrity? Nothing personal to anybody, but I'm sure that all of the players, many of them are household names in the food industry and in the major packaging industries. I'm sure they're all as trustworthy and honest as Volkswagen or anybody, say, to pick a random example. Every time you have rules, there are operators, business operators, who will sense an advantage from flouting them. Okay? This is part of life. And we do need to be aware that perhaps outside the confines of this gathering, which probably tends to bring together the people who have serious commitments to the food safety of food and the packaging, that there are people who will undercut, not pay attention to the rules, and deliberately flout them. I'll show you a couple of slides related to the frauds we have found in food. You may not be able to see them terribly well, but these packages of crisps here have a certain best before by date on them, and this photograph was taken in a food business operator who had a nice little business of wiping off the best before dates and printing on nicer ones with a longer best before date on them to give added value to his product. Okay, that's a reality. When our inspectors have been on some investigations, they asked our national police to accompany them, and when the national police, the Gardaí, heard who the particular food business operator was, they decided that this was how they would tug out, and this photograph was taken by one of our inspectors. So there are different operators, and this is in the food industry, so we have to assume that the same, at least in theory, could apply. Little example, perhaps, on a food contact material side. This is, I'll just highlight a couple of points from this, and I know it's small print. it declares here that these are nylon whisks. This is a declaration for omission of items from the EU Regulation 284/2011, which concerns the polyamide articles. And this one is a confident declaration saying that these particular nylon utensils do not contain polyamide plastic. Okay, I hereby declare the above statement to be true. Okay, this is a real example of a documentation that we see. So we can't be naive in these things either. So, and speaking as the agency which I suppose was the first to detect the horse meat substitution for beef, if it can happen for the major ingredients in the food, then surely it can happen to the minor ingredients or the packaging. The second assumption I'd like to move on to is expertise. I'm sorry, I want to watch my time. We assume that everybody is at the same kind of high level of knowledge and expertise that the people in this room are with regards to the issue of food packaging. And again, when you think of that kind of complexity in the supply chain, the number of operators, and a kind of a general tendency that as you move down that chain, you tend to move into smaller sectors perhaps. There's huge numbers of SMEs, small, medium enterprises, micro-enterprises operating in the food industry, small converters as well. And to imagine that they all have the kind of dedicated quality and regulatory teams and the kind of level of expertise is not something we can rely on. So to be able to kind of okay, I'll skip these points. Just about the need for people to realise that the actual use of the packaging matches the intended use is a key point here. We've been working on some supports for inspectors, manufacturers, importers, distributors, any food businesses, anybody who can find them useful. They are available on our website. If you just search food contact materials. These slides will be available afterwards. We've produced an e-learning module which covers and asks various kinds of questions to test people's understanding of the issues, and takes them through scenarios and asks them to find their way and identify food contact materials in various situations, to identify what kind of documentation might be useful to look at. It was designed for our inspectors, but we've made the module generally available. And this slide starts a video, which I think we probably don't have time to play, but it is a soundtrack.
Food contact material move or migrate into the food itself,
Okay.
as is shown here.
We'll get the impression. It gives a simple... These are simple animations to kind of illustrate key points. So we've got ones that illustrate points about how migration occurs, the effects of temperature and the rate of migration, the importance of the surface to volume ratio, the importance of different food types and its effect on migration. These are vital points for businesses to go. I mean, I know there's commission guidance and information in the supply chain, but the commission guidance is in itself very complicated. And I think simple materials like this are needed. Okay, declarations of compliance, just to make the point that they're terribly important. So we have produced a software to basically make that a bit easier and to produce a checklist that can assist a plastics manufacturer who wants to check if his declaration of compliance covers the required points. I'll move on. We've produced a sample of a declaration of compliance outlining, at least in theory, for this particular simple case, where the key information can be found. It's just a sample. We just wanted to illustrate the point that it doesn't have to be a very complicated or a very long document. So it shows it in various parts. Okay, just to make one final point, at the end of this year sees the end of the transitional regime of testing. So we're advising the food industry in particular that the declarations of compliance that they get from then on should always be based on the new testing regime and the new supporting documentation, which is an important point there. So I'll leave the summary and say thank you very much for your attention.